It was supposed to be just another Wednesday. Darius Walker walked into Jefferson Hall, clutching a black notebook and a to-go cup of black coffee he hadn't even sipped yet. It was already halfway cold. He slid into his usual seat in the third row of Legal Theory 204, a course reserved for juniors and seniors on the pre-law track. Darius had taken it early, one of the perks of staying 2 steps ahead. His mother used to say, "You gotta be smarter, faster, and quieter than everybody else, baby." He had learned to walk like that. But today, something was off before the class even began. The room buzzed with low conversation, keyboards clicking, phones glowing. The ceiling lights flickered with the fatigue of a century-old building that looked prestigious from the outside but breathed neglect from within. Zoe glanced over at him, brushing a lock of her dark curls from her cheek and whispering, "Did you finish Carter's reading?" He assigned 50 pages and didn't explain half of it. Darius gave her a tired smile, nodded, and opened his notebook to a page already scrawled with quotes and margin notes. Alex, seated to his right, slid him a protein bar, as he did most mornings when Darius skipped breakfast to catch the early bus. At 9:06 a.m., Professor William Carter arrived, wearing his signature bow tie and thick-rimmed glasses. His loafers clapped the linoleum with an entitlement that matched his tone whenever he spoke. Carter had taught at Westbridge University for nearly 30 years. He was considered an institution in himself, one that came with tenure, unquestioned authority, and a dangerous fondness for debate. The kind of man who smiled when someone cried during an argument because it meant, to him, that the point had landed. His voice was deep and gravelly, as if he chewed on granite and privilege. Today's topic was Locke and Hobbes, the foundations of social contract theory. Carter scribbled a quote across the board. "Where there is no law, there is no freedom." He turned, cleared his throat dramatically, and launched into his lecture. Darius scribbled down key terms, his pen moving with the practiced rhythm of someone who knew the stakes. He didn't come from generational wealth or Ivy-educated parents. He came from the south side of Atlanta, raised by a single mother who worked night shifts at the hospital and ironed his shirts before scholarship interviews. Every second in that chair was something he had earned. Then, without warning, Carter's tone shifted. He stepped away from the podium and wandered to the center of the room like a man performing Shakespeare. "Now," he said, "one of the more interesting complications of Locke's theory is how it interacts with different cultural understandings of property and justice. After all," he paused, smirking, "not all communities value these concepts in the same way." He turned his head deliberately. His eyes landed squarely on Darius. "Take Mr. Walker, for example. I'm sure you've seen how certain backgrounds can influence one's perception of law and order. Tell us, Mr. Walker, where exactly do you come from again?" The words dropped like a lit match in dry grass. At first, Darius didn't react. His hand paused mid-sentence. He looked up, blinking once, twice, trying to process if he had heard correctly. The room shifted. The rustling stopped. The air changed. All eyes were on him now, but none of them moved. It was as if the students became furniture, stiff, uncomfortable, and afraid to creak. Darius straightened his back, heart pounding in his chest. "I'm sorry, Professor." Carter tilted his head. "No offense intended. Just saying your background might offer a unique cultural lens. It's good for discussion. You know, diversity of thought." He waved the term like a shield. Zoe's hand went stiff around her pen. Alex muttered something under his breath that sounded like a curse. Darius didn't respond. He couldn't. Not yet. He sat there, every cell in his body screaming, telling him to stand up, to say something, anything. But that voice inside, the one that told him to keep his head down, not mess up what he'd worked so hard for, was louder. It always had been. Carter moved on, seamlessly, as though what he'd said was academic, not personal. As if reducing a student to a stereotype was just another Socratic exercise. The lecture carried on, but the atmosphere never returned. Darius heard none of it. The words blurred into noise as his pulse echoed in his ears. He was no longer in Jefferson Hall. He was 13 again, being followed by a store clerk. He was 16, stopped by police walking home from tutoring. He was 18, sitting in a college interview as the dean asked, "Do you feel comfortable here?" And now he was 20, back in the third row, humiliated, in front of 70 peers who all heard what Carter had said, and chose to say nothing. When the lecture ended, students packed up quickly. No one made eye contact. A few glanced his way, mouths tight, unsure whether to apologize or pretend nothing had happened. Zoe touched his arm gently. "That was messed up. You okay?" He nodded, lying with his face. Alex stayed close as they walked into the hallway. "You want to go to the dean? We can write it up. I'll back you." Darius shook his head. "You think the school's gonna take a stand against one of their own? Carter is the department." Alex clenched his fists but said nothing more. Zoe trailed behind, clearly unsure whether to follow him or give him space. Outside, the wind had picked up. Autumn had finally arrived in Georgia, and the breeze cut through Darius's hoodie like a knife. He found himself walking across campus without purpose, eventually ending up near the administration building. There, he sat on a concrete ledge beneath a towering oak tree, legs swinging over the side like he used to do as a kid on the fire escape. He pulled out his phone. A notification blinked across his screen, Westbridge class chat, 3 new messages. He opened it and saw a video. Blurry. Someone had filmed the moment. Carter's voice was loud and clear, "Where exactly do you come from again?" Below it, the comments piled in. WTF. Did he really say that? That man's been getting away with this for years. Darius, we got your back. It hit him like a tidal wave. Proof. Witnesses. He wasn't just imagining it. And he wasn't alone. But what now? He could stay quiet, finish the semester, and graduate with honors. That was the safe path. The silent path. The one so many before him had taken because the system wasn't built to protect them. Or he could speak. Loudly. Risk everything. Not just for himself, but for every student who'd ever been talked down to, erased, or turned into a lesson. He stared at the video again, watching his own silence play back in a loop. He didn't look angry. He looked small. And that image burned more than Carter's words. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming dignity. About truth. About breaking the cycle his mother had endured, and her mother before her. Maybe it was time someone said enough. He stood up slowly, phone in hand, jaw set. Let them hear him now. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Darius Walker was never supposed to be here. Not in this university. Not on this campus, surrounded by towering brick buildings with names like Langston and Remington etched in marble. Not in classrooms with leather chairs and chandeliers. Not where the grass seemed greener, because someone was always paid to make it that way. He came from a place where grass cracked through concrete and every bus ride home was a study in survival. South Atlanta wasn't on the brochures. It was a neighborhood of corner stores with dusty bulletproof glass, of aunties who sold plates from their kitchens on Saturdays, and kids who memorized bus schedules before they knew the Pledge of Allegiance. But it was also a place of stubborn joy. Laughter in the middle of loud music and louder sirens. Barbershops that felt like town halls. Church choirs that could shake the walls of the old Baptist building on Moreland Avenue. That was where Darius grew up, with one parent, one bed, and more ambition than space to contain it. His mother, Denise Walker, was a nurse technician who worked back-to-back shifts at Grady Hospital. She had the kind of hands that could stop a wound from bleeding and the kind of voice that could bring a room back from chaos. She raised Darius alone after his father disappeared when he was 4, leaving nothing behind but a stack of overdue bills and a half-finished tattoo on his arm. Denise never talked about him. She didn't have time for bitterness. She was too busy working, saving, pushing. Darius learned early that the world wasn't fair and it didn't pretend to be. His first memory of school was being pulled aside in kindergarten for talking too much, even though he'd just answered a question out loud like every other kid. By the time he was in 4th grade, he knew the principal by name. Not because he was trouble, but because he wasn't afraid to speak. And sometimes, being black and unafraid was enough to earn suspicion. He remembered the day in middle school when he was walking home and a patrol car pulled up beside him. The officer rolled down the window and asked if he was skipping. Darius showed him his ID and pointed to the school he had just left. Still, the man made him sit on the curb and empty his backpack. Said it was standard procedure. That night, Darius didn't tell his mom. He just sat in the living room, staring at the TV, knowing something inside him had shifted. He made a promise to himself that year: if the world was going to look at him sideways, he'd give it something to stare at. He started studying harder, staying late at the library, joining debate club, even though no one else from his neighborhood did. He stopped correcting teachers when they pronounced his name wrong. He just made sure his name was at the top of every honors list. He won the citywide mock trial tournament 2 years in a row. Got a recommendation letter from a judge who called him exceptionally poised. Applied to colleges with trembling fingers. When Westbridge University sent him an acceptance email, and later, a full scholarship, his mother cried into a paper towel at the kitchen table. She didn't say much. Just hugged him tight and whispered, "You better walk in there like you own it." But walking into Westbridge had felt like walking into a different country. The kind where students wore Patagonia and talked about internships at their dad's law firms. Where phrases like "legacy admit" and "summered in the Hamptons" were normal conversation. Where people raised their hands not to learn, but to prove they already knew. Darius kept his head down, turned in every assignment early, and made himself smaller in classrooms that didn't feel made for him. Except, he couldn't shrink forever. He had friends, good ones. Alex, who came from Vermont and had a talent for debate that got him a national championship title. Zoe, who grew up in Baltimore and had a fire in her voice that could melt ignorance. They were more than classmates, they were his people. But even with them, there were parts of Darius he didn't share. Like the letters he kept in a shoebox under his bed, rejection letters from internships that never said why. Or the day he went to office hours and was told, "You speak well. You'll do fine if you keep your head on straight." Still, he rose. He joined the Black Student Union, volunteered at the local juvenile center, tutored first-years who didn't know how to navigate a campus like Westbridge. He walked with purpose, not arrogance. Confidence wrapped in discipline. But behind it all was a boy who had learned to measure every word, every look, every silence. And it wasn't just for him. It was for his mother, who worked 12-hour shifts and sent him meal money even when he didn't ask. It was for his cousin Terrence, who was still fighting a weed charge from 3 years ago. It was for every kid at Southside High who said, "You're gonna make it out, bro." So when Carter said what he said in that lecture hall, when he looked at Darius and reduced him to, "wherever you come from," it wasn't just an insult. It was a crack in the wall Darius had built. A wall held together by self-control and carefully practiced composure. And once something cracked, it didn't take much for it to fall apart. He didn't sleep that night. Not really. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, headphones in, playing a rotation of Kendrick, Sam Cooke, and silence. The words from class kept replaying in his head like a broken loop. "Where exactly do you come from again?" The laughter. The absence of outrage. The absence of anything. At 2:23 a.m., he opened his laptop and started writing. Not for class. Not for Carter. For himself. The words poured out like breath he'd been holding for years. I come from a place where silence is survival, but speaking is power. I come from blood that learned how to turn pain into poetry and chains into progress. I come from a mother who taught me that dignity isn't something you're given, it's something you protect, even when no one else does. He didn't know if he'd ever show anyone those words. But writing them made something inside him shift. He wasn't invisible. He wasn't alone. And he damn sure wasn't going to stay silent much longer. The days following Professor Carter's comment passed in a haze. Darius sat through every class with a tight grip on his emotions. His notebooks, usually filled with neatly written notes and diagrams, now held angry scribbles. In the margins, he wrote questions he didn't know how to answer, questions that didn't belong in textbooks. Why did it take this for me to realize that I've been holding my breath this whole time? How many times have I let this go, thinking it would be easier just to smile and move on? Everywhere he went, the whispers followed. Even when he walked across campus to the dining hall, he felt the eyes on him. Some students looked at him with pity. Others with curiosity. There were the well-meaning, "I'm so sorry you had to deal with that," messages from his friends. But there were also the ones that stung the most, the looks of discomfort, the silence. The ones who just didn't know what to say. Darius tried to ignore it all, but he couldn't. The quiet was suffocating. It was as though he were on a stage where everyone was waiting for him to perform, but no one knew their lines. Even Zoe and Alex, his two closest allies, seemed hesitant around him. Zoe kept trying to bring up the issue, but Darius shut her down every time. "It's fine. Let's focus on our finals," he'd say, though it wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. That evening, the breaking point came. It was a Tuesday, and Darius had just finished his shift at the campus library. His phone buzzed in his pocket as he walked out into the chilled night air. He pulled it out, his heart dropping when he saw the name on the screen. It was a message from his cousin, Terrence. Terrence wasn't the kind of person to sugarcoat things. He had spent most of his life on the wrong side of the law, bouncing between juvenile detention centers and the streets. But there was an honesty in him that Darius had always respected. Terrence had made a lot of mistakes, but he'd also learned from them. It was the kind of wisdom Darius couldn't ignore, even if he didn't always understand it. The text read, "Yo Darius, I heard about what happened with that professor. Man, this ain't right. You gotta do something about it. Don't let him get away with disrespecting you. You got a voice now. Use it." Darius stopped walking in the middle of the sidewalk, his fingers hovering over the screen. The night was colder than usual, and he could feel the weight of his jacket pressing against his shoulders, as if the world was bearing down on him. He thought about his mother. Denise, who had spent her entire life working jobs no one else wanted, teaching Darius that silence was sometimes the price of survival. He thought about the years he had spent keeping his head down, learning how to blend in so he wouldn't be noticed. But what was the point of being invisible if no one heard you when you finally spoke? He began typing. "I don't know, man. I've been trying to keep it together. People are acting like it's not a big deal, and honestly, I don't want to cause a scene. This stuff happens all the time, right?" His finger hovered over the send button for a long time. He wanted to send it. He wanted to make it go away. But he knew, deep down, that sending it would be the easy way out. And Darius Walker was done taking the easy way out. His thumb moved swiftly and decisively. "Nah. You're right. I can't let it slide." He hit send and put the phone in his pocket. He stood there for a moment, as if the weight of his decision had just landed on his chest all at once. His heart pounded in his ears, louder than anything else around him. The cool wind bit at his skin, and yet he felt oddly warm inside. He was finally taking the first step towards something that had been building inside him for years. But the truth was, he still didn't know exactly what that something would look like. The next day, Darius found himself standing outside Professor Carter's office, his hand hovering over the door handle. He had texted Zoe and Alex, asking them to meet him here. They had both responded almost immediately, though neither had made any promises about what would happen next. Zoe was determined to support him, while Alex seemed to think he should at least talk it out first before escalating it. "You sure about this, man?" Alex had asked when they had met outside the office. "Carter's got tenure. It's gonna be hard to take him down. It could blow back on you." Darius had nodded, though he wasn't so sure. But now, standing in front of the door, he felt a strange sense of resolve wash over him. He couldn't turn back now, not after everything that had happened. Zoe placed a hand on his shoulder. "We're with you, Darius. No matter what." He smiled weakly at her, though the smile didn't reach his eyes. He had no idea what he was about to do, but at least he wouldn't have to do it alone. He knocked on the door. The voice that called him in was unmistakable, Professor Carter's deep, authoritative tone that never left room for negotiation. "Come in, Mr. Walker." Darius stepped inside, followed by Zoe and Alex. Carter was behind his desk, papers scattered in front of him. He didn't look surprised to see them. He simply raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Walker, what can I do for you?" Carter asked, his voice dripping with feigned curiosity. "I assume this is about yesterday?" Darius felt the rush of adrenaline and nerves hit him all at once. He cleared his throat, his voice steadier than he felt. "It is. And I'm not here to debate theory. I'm here because what you said in class was wrong. It wasn't just a comment, Professor, it was a stereotype. A dehumanizing remark. And I'm asking you to acknowledge that." Carter's face flickered with something Darius couldn't read, but it was quickly masked by a smooth, practiced smile. "Mr. Walker, I assure you, there was no ill intent. It was just a rhetorical question. You know how passionate I get about discussion." Zoe stepped forward, her voice firm. "It wasn't a rhetorical question. It was an attack. And it hurt." Darius turned to her, his chest tight. He had no idea what would happen next, but in that moment, he realized he was already standing taller than he ever had before. They were right, he wasn't alone. And whatever came next, he had the courage to face it. Professor Carter leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I see. Well, I'm sure we can resolve this in a civil manner." Darius met his gaze head-on, the weight of the moment settling in. The confrontation had begun. The tension in Professor Carter's office was thick enough to cut with a knife. Darius stood there, staring across the desk at the man who had, only days earlier, seemed like a figure of authority and knowledge. Now, Carter's confident facade seemed to waver as he sat there, his fingers still steepled in front of him. There was a brief, uncomfortable silence that seemed to stretch far longer than it should have. "I'm sure we can find a way to resolve this," Carter said again, his voice now much softer, but not without a hint of irritation. "I didn't intend to offend you, Mr. Walker. You must understand that." Darius could feel the hot rush of anger building in his chest, but he held it in check. He could hear Zoe's words in his mind, "Don't back down. This isn't just about your pride, it's about making sure he doesn't think he can do this again." Darius took a deep breath, making sure his voice was steady as he spoke. "No, Professor, it's not just about me. It's about all of us. The students who don't get to speak out when something like this happens, the ones who don't have the chance to stand up for themselves. You can't just brush this off as a rhetorical question. You've reduced an entire group of people to stereotypes, without even realizing it." Zoe, standing beside him, nodded. "And it's not just about one comment, Professor. It's about a culture that lets things like this slide. You've created an environment where people like Darius, and others like him, are forced to shrink themselves in order to fit in." Professor Carter's expression flickered. It was clear now that the one certain professor was beginning to question the foundation of his beliefs. But instead of immediately conceding, he leaned forward in his chair, his voice steady but edged with defensive authority. I understand your concerns, but this is a discussion of ideas, not identity. I don't think this is something that needs to be blown out of proportion. Darius clenched his fists, the words echoing in his mind, blown out of proportion. He felt the weight of every conversation he had ever had where his experiences, his identity, had been minimized, swept aside. It wasn't just Carter's comment, it was everything that had led up to this moment. All the times he had been told to tone it down or be more professional. All the times he'd heard, I'm not racist, but. This wasn't a single isolated incident, it was part of a pattern. A pattern that was bigger than one man or one classroom. And it wasn't just happening at Westbridge. Darius could feel it in the very air around him. He had seen it in the way his professors, the administration, and even some of his peers reacted when issues of race were brought up. They would say the right words, words like diversity, inclusion, justice. But when it came time to act, the words rang hollow. It was clear that those words didn't carry the same weight for everyone. Especially not for people like him. I don't need you to agree with me, Professor, Darius said, his voice steady, but stronger now, filled with the conviction of someone who had carried this burden for far too long. But you need to understand that words matter. And your words are hurting people. And we're tired of being told to just accept it, to move on. This isn't something that just goes away. The room grew silent again, and Darius could feel the weight of his own words settling in. But it was Zoe who broke the silence this time, her voice unwavering. I think what Darius is trying to say, Professor, she began, her eyes now locked on Carter's, is that you can't just be neutral in situations like this. Silence is complicity. By not standing up and acknowledging the impact of your words, you are choosing the side of the status quo. The side that benefits from people like Darius remaining quiet. There it was, the truth Darius hadn't fully realized until this very moment. Silence had always been the default, both his and others. He had learned to navigate spaces where his voice was secondary, where the expectation was for him to remain quiet, to not ruffle any feathers. But that had changed. Not only because of Carter's comment, but because of everything he had learned in the years leading up to this point. He couldn't remain silent any longer. Professor Carter's face grew darker as he took in their words. It was clear now that he wasn't used to being challenged in this way, not by his students. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the door swung open, and a figure stepped inside. It was Dean Thompson, the head of the Department of Philosophy and one of the more respected administrators at Westbridge. I hope I'm not interrupting anything, the dean said coolly, his gaze flicking between Carter and the group standing in front of him. I was informed that there was a matter that needed addressing. Darius felt the air shift in the room. This was it, the moment when things could either spiral out of control or take a turn that would make everything feel worth it. He wasn't sure what he expected from the dean, but the timing couldn't have been more critical. His heart raced, but his resolve only grew stronger. Carter stood up quickly, brushing his hands off his pants. Dean Thompson, I was just having a discussion with Mr. Walker and his colleagues about a recent comment that seems to have been misunderstood. He seemed to search for the right words, but the dean wasn't fooled. Misunderstood? Dean Thompson's voice was sharp now. He turned to Darius and Zoe, his eyes scanning their faces. Would you care to elaborate on what exactly has been misunderstood? Darius stepped forward, heart pounding, but this time, there was no hesitation. He had taken this step for a reason, and he wasn't going to back down. What happened was more than a misunderstanding. It was a comment based on assumptions, a comment that reinforces harmful stereotypes about black people. And what's more, it's part of a larger issue, a culture of silence when it comes to these issues. It's a culture that has allowed people like me to feel like we don't matter, like we don't belong. Dean Thompson nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. He turned to Professor Carter, then back to Darius. I see. And what do you suggest we do about it? Darius felt the weight of the question. His mind raced, but he knew the answer. He'd known it all along, even if he hadn't been able to articulate it until now. This wasn't just about Carter. It wasn't just about one classroom or one incident. It was about a system that needed to change. And it was going to start right here. I suggest we start by having an open, honest conversation about the impact of comments like Professor Carter's. I suggest we make it clear that silence is no longer an option. That the voices of students like me matter. And I suggest that we make sure that no one else has to go through what I've gone through. Not here, not ever again. The room was silent for a moment. Then Dean Thompson nodded once, sharply. I think that's a very reasonable place to start. Let's discuss how we move forward. Darius exhaled, a sense of relief washing over him. He didn't know what the future held, but at least he knew this much: the battle had begun. Darius walked out of Professor Carter's office with a mix of disbelief and exhaustion. The confrontation had left him feeling as though he had just weathered a storm. His heart was pounding, his mind still racing with the words he had said, the words he had wanted to say but didn't. For a moment, it felt like the air around him was different, heavier, as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Zoe and Alex walked with him, their silence louder than words. He could feel their support, but there was also a certain wariness in the way they held themselves, unsure of what would happen next. Dean Thompson had seemed receptive to Darius's concerns, but there was something about the way he had asked, "What do you suggest we do about it?" that didn't sit well with him. The dean hadn't promised anything concrete. There was no guarantee that anything would actually change. In that moment, Darius couldn't help but wonder if he was just another student who had raised a concern, only to have it swept under the rug. As the three of them walked through the campus, Darius's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, surprised to see a message from Terrence, his cousin. "Yo, what's the word? You good?" Darius stared at the text for a moment. He should have responded sooner, but he hadn't been able to process everything. Now, as he looked at the simple message, it felt like the universe was reminding him that he wasn't alone. Terrence always seemed to cut through the noise, to see things clearly in a way that Darius couldn't always grasp. He started typing. "It's complicated. I'm starting to realize that I've been fighting for something bigger than just myself. But I don't know if I'm ready for what's coming." The text was honest, raw, and uncertain, just like Darius felt. He hit send before he could overthink it. His phone buzzed almost immediately. "You don't have to do it alone, Darius. I got your back. Always." A small smile tugged at Darius's lips. For the first time in days, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. He wasn't alone. But what he didn't yet realize was how much the coming days would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, about the system he was fighting, and about the cost of speaking out. The next day, Darius received an unexpected email. It was from Dean Thompson, and the subject line was straightforward: "Follow up on your concerns." He opened it with a sense of apprehension, wondering what, if anything, had changed. The email itself was polite but vague. It expressed appreciation for his concerns and reassured him that the matter was being looked into. However, there was no mention of any specific actions, no acknowledgement of the profound impact his words had on the campus, and certainly no indication that the culture of silence Darius had called out would be addressed. The only concrete statement was that Professor Carter would be offering a public apology in the coming week. A public apology. That was it. Darius stared at the screen, his stomach sinking. An apology meant nothing if the system itself remained unchanged. He had expected this kind of response, he had feared it, but seeing it in writing made it feel all the more real. It was like a slap in the face, a reminder that the institution he had trusted to provide a safe and inclusive environment was, at its core, just as flawed as the people within it. He didn't respond to the email. Instead, he closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, trying to process the weight of everything. Zoe and Alex had been right. This wasn't just about one comment, it was about a system that allowed this behavior to continue. But what could he do? What could any of them do? They were just students, just small pieces in a much larger, much more powerful machine. Darius felt himself spiraling. All his life, he had fought to stay under the radar. To be seen as one of the good ones, to avoid the label of being too loud or too angry. He had worked hard to get here, to prove that he belonged. But now, the fight felt bigger than just him. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel less than, who had been told that their experiences didn't matter. The problem wasn't just in the classroom or with Professor Carter, it was everywhere. The administration, the faculty, even the students who quietly accepted the status quo. It was ingrained in the very fabric of the university. What if they were all complicit? The thought hit him hard, and for a moment, it paralyzed him. What was the point of speaking out if it didn't matter? What if the university was more concerned with protecting its reputation than with actually listening to its students? The buzz of his phone interrupted his thoughts. It was a message from his mother, Denise. "Darius, I heard about what happened. Are you okay?" The words were simple, but they cut through the fog of his frustration. He had always turned to his mother for support, but this time, her question felt different. It wasn't just about his well-being, it was about what he was willing to risk to make a change. He typed quickly, his fingers trembling slightly as he spoke from his heart. "I don't know, Mom. I'm trying to do the right thing, but it feels like everything is stacked against me. The dean doesn't care. Carter's getting off easy. And I feel like I'm just one person against this whole system." He paused, staring at the message, and then added. "But maybe that's the point. Maybe it's supposed to feel like this." A few moments passed before her response came through. "You've always been strong, Darius. You've always fought for what's right. And just because things seem hard doesn't mean you give up. You have a voice, and that voice matters. But don't forget, you don't have to fight alone." Darius read the message over and over again. His mother had always known the right thing to say, even when he didn't. The weight of his decision was still there, still heavy, but he realized something. This wasn't just about the apology, or the apology that wasn't coming. It was about standing up for himself, and for everyone who had been silenced, ignored, or diminished by a system that had never cared about their voices in the first place. The next day, Darius decided to take a stand in a way that would make it impossible for the university to ignore him anymore. It wasn't going to be easy, and he wasn't sure what the outcome would be, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let them sweep this under the rug. He typed up a letter, addressed to the entire student body, outlining his experience, his feelings, and the systemic issues that were at play. He didn't hold back. He named names, including Professor Carter, and he didn't mince words about the failure of the administration to take any real action. He called for change. For real, tangible change. The letter was clear, impassioned, and it left no room for misinterpretation. Darius wasn't asking for change. He was demanding it. Before sending it out, he looked at the letter one last time. The fear that had kept him silent for so long gnawed at him, but it was different this time. His heart was beating faster, but it wasn't fear, it was determination. He hit send. The email had barely been sent when Darius felt a rush of dread. His finger hovered over the screen for just a second before he clicked the send button. In an instant, the words he had written to the student body were out there. There was no taking them back now. As the hours ticked by, Darius tried to focus on his studies. But the texts and notifications on his phone kept coming in, faster than he could keep up with. Zoe's message was the first to appear, marked with an exclamation point. "You did it. You actually did it." He smiled weakly at her message but couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The rush of adrenaline that had accompanied sending the letter was beginning to fade, replaced by the cold reality of what might come next. He had no idea how the administration, his professors, or even his fellow students would react. Was he really ready for this? Darius glanced around the library, trying to focus on his textbook, but every passing minute felt like an eternity. The letter had gone viral on campus, circulated through email, social media, and word of mouth. Everyone had seen it, read it, and probably formed their own opinions about him. He wasn't sure whether they would see him as a hero or as a troublemaker. Either way, he knew there would be consequences. It didn't take long for those consequences to materialize. By the end of the day, Darius received an official notice from the dean's office requesting a meeting. The subject line read, "Urgent. Follow-up regarding recent letter to the student body." His heart skipped a beat. He could already guess what it would be about. The university would want him to walk back his words, apologize, or at the very least, tone down his stance. They couldn't let a student openly challenge their authority without pushing back. He wasn't going to apologize, though. He had made his stance clear. The fight was just beginning. The next morning, Darius walked into the dean's office with Zoe and Alex by his side. He had asked them to come for support. The three of them sat in the waiting area, a sense of unease settling over them as they waited for the meeting to begin. Zoe kept glancing at her phone, no doubt reading the messages that were flooding in from classmates who had read the letter. Alex was silent, his usual smile replaced by a look of concern. "Do you think they're going to kick him out?" Zoe asked quietly. "I don't know," Darius replied, his voice calm despite the growing anxiety inside him. "But they can't silence me. Not anymore." Alex nodded, his expression hardening. "We've got your back, man. No matter what." Before Darius could respond, the door to the dean's office opened. Dean Thompson stood in the doorway, his expression a mix of professionalism and something else, something Darius couldn't quite read. Behind him, Professor Carter's face was dark, his features tense. "Mr. Walker," the dean said, his tone neutral. "Please, come in." Darius stood up and walked into the office, followed by Zoe and Alex. They sat down, and the tension in the room was palpable. The dean shut the door behind him, then turned to Darius. "I'm sure you're aware of the gravity of your actions, Mr. Walker," Dean Thompson began, his voice measured but stern. "Your letter has caused quite a stir on campus. I've had several faculty members reach out to express their concerns about your accusations. Some students are even calling for a boycott of certain classes, claiming that your remarks about the university's culture are a direct threat to their education." Darius could feel the pressure building in his chest, but he refused to flinch. He wasn't backing down now. "I stand by what I wrote. The culture here needs to change, and I'm not going to pretend that everything is fine just because it's convenient for you or for anyone else." Professor Carter, who had been standing in the corner, stepped forward. "Mr. Walker, I understand that you are upset, but accusing me of perpetuating harmful stereotypes isn't productive. I've dedicated my life to academia and fostering critical thinking. I've helped countless students, and to have my career and reputation called into question like this is, well, it's disappointing." Darius looked him straight in the eye. "It's disappointing to me, too, Professor. I didn't want to have to do this, but when you perpetuate stereotypes without even realizing it, it hurts. And I'm not going to just sit back and let it slide. Not anymore." The room grew tense. Dean Thompson's gaze shifted between Darius and Professor Carter, clearly caught between two opposing forces. "I understand that you're upset," the dean said slowly. "But there are appropriate ways to address these concerns. Writing a public letter without consulting the proper channels, without considering the consequences for your peers, your professors, and the university, was reckless." "Reckless?" Darius's voice rose slightly. "What's reckless is ignoring the problem, pretending it doesn't exist. You're more concerned with the university's reputation than with fixing the issues that led to me writing that letter in the first place." Zoe leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. Darius isn't the only one who feels this way. There are students who have been silenced, students who have been ignored, students who feel like they don't matter. The real question here is not whether Darius's letter was reckless, but why no one is asking why he felt the need to write it. The dean's expression hardened. This is a serious matter. The university prides itself on creating a learning environment where all voices can be heard. We are not here to take sides but to mediate and find a solution that works for everyone. Alex, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. If you really want a solution, then you need to listen. You need to understand that this is about more than just a letter. It's about a culture of silence, a culture where students like Darius feel like they don't belong. If you care about change, then start by acknowledging that there's a problem. Darius couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had always known that Zoe and Alex were on his side, but hearing them speak out with such conviction made him feel less alone. It was a reminder that he didn't have to carry this burden by himself. The dean was silent for a long moment, clearly processing the situation. Finally, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. I understand your concerns. But I also understand the importance of maintaining order. This isn't just about one student or one comment. It's about how we move forward as a community. The university will be holding a town hall meeting next week to address these issues, and I expect you to participate. Darius felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. A town hall meeting was better than nothing, but it still felt like a far cry from the immediate action he had hoped for. Nonetheless, it was a step in the right direction. The conversation was happening. You'll be hearing from us soon, Dean Thompson added, his tone firm. In the meantime, I strongly suggest that you take some time to reflect on your actions and the impact they've had on the campus community. Darius didn't respond. He stood up, his friends following his lead. I've already reflected, he said, his voice steady. And I'll keep reflecting, but I'm not backing down. This fight isn't over. As they left the office, Darius's heart was still racing. The meeting had been intense, and he wasn't sure what the outcome would be. But one thing was certain, he had made his stand, and there was no going back. The fallout had only just begun, but Darius was ready. Ready to face whatever came next. Ready to keep fighting. The town hall was scheduled for Wednesday evening, and as the day approached, Darius's anxiety grew. He had never been a fan of public speaking, especially not in front of an audience as large as the one he expected. Still, he knew this was his moment. This was the opportunity to confront the system head-on, to challenge not only Professor Carter's actions but the larger culture at the university that allowed them to fester. He had thought long and hard about what he would say at the town hall, rehearsing his words in the mirror, writing and rewriting his speech until it felt just right. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just about the words. It was about the fight itself, about standing up for those who had been silenced for too long, about pushing for real change even when it felt like the odds were stacked against him. The atmosphere in the university auditorium was tense as students and faculty gathered, murmuring amongst themselves. Zoe, Alex, and several other friends had arrived early to support Darius, but the crowd was divided. Some students looked excited, ready to hear Darius's side of the story, while others, especially the professors who had criticized him, exchanged glances, their expressions skeptical, even hostile. Darius could feel their eyes on him, some with judgment, others with curiosity. As he stood near the back of the room, he noticed Professor Carter in the front row, a slight frown on his face. The man seemed as if he were steeling himself for the confrontation that was about to unfold. Darius had half expected Carter to take the back seat in the meeting, but it seemed clear that the professor was ready to defend himself, no matter what. The lights dimmed, signaling the start of the meeting. Dean Thompson stepped onto the stage, his voice booming across the room as he addressed the crowd. Good evening, everyone, he began, his tone firm and authoritative. Thank you for attending tonight's town hall. As you all know, the recent letter written by Mr. Walker has sparked some very important conversations about race, inclusion, and the culture of our institution. Tonight, We will listen to all voices, faculty, students, and administration, so that we can engage in a meaningful dialogue about how we can move forward together. Let's keep this discussion respectful. Darius felt his stomach tighten. He had never been comfortable in settings like this, surrounded by so many people, many of whom were strangers to him. But tonight, it wasn't about comfort. It was about truth. About making sure that the voices that had been silenced, including his own, were finally heard. The dean motioned to a microphone at the front of the room. "We'll begin with Mr. Walker," he said. "Please, come forward." Darius's heart raced as he walked toward the stage, his legs feeling like they were made of lead. As he approached the microphone, he noticed the sea of eyes on him. Some were curious, others judgmental, but all were waiting for him to speak. He cleared his throat, trying to calm his nerves, but his voice came out stronger than he expected. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak," he began, his words filling the room. "I'm not here to point fingers or to make anyone feel guilty. I'm here because we have a problem, a real problem. And it's time we started talking about it." There was a slight murmur in the crowd. Darius could feel the tension growing. "Over the past few weeks, I've seen and experienced things that I never expected to encounter at a place like this. I've seen faculty members perpetuate harmful stereotypes about students of color, and I've seen a system that is more interested in preserving its reputation than in protecting its students. I wrote my letter because I couldn't stay silent anymore. Not when I knew that my silence was complicit in a system that benefits those who already have power at the expense of those who don't." The words felt like they were coming from a place deep inside him. His hands shook slightly as he held onto the microphone, but he didn't back down. "Professor Carter's comment was the breaking point for me. But it's not just about one professor. It's about the way this institution turns a blind eye to the issues of race, inequality, and microaggressions that are happening every single day. How many students like me have been ignored? How many have been made to feel small or invisible? How many times has the university swept these issues under the rug instead of confronting them head-on?" The room was silent now. Darius could feel the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. He looked around at the faces in the crowd, some uncomfortable, others visibly tense. He knew he had their attention. "I'm not here to ask for apologies or for forgiveness. I'm here to demand change," he continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Change isn't going to come from polite conversations in private meetings. Change is messy. It's uncomfortable. And it requires people to take risks. It's time that the university stop pretending that these problems don't exist. It's time to do the real work. The hard work." He paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts. His gaze shifted toward Professor Carter, who was now staring at him with a hardened expression. But Darius didn't flinch. "I know that change doesn't come easy. I know that some people in this room will try to silence me, try to convince me that I'm wrong. But I won't back down. Because the truth is, I'm not just fighting for myself. I'm fighting for everyone who has ever been told they don't belong here. For everyone who's been made to feel invisible. And for everyone who's been made to think their voice doesn't matter." There was a brief moment of silence before the crowd erupted into applause. Darius could hardly believe it. He hadn't expected this kind of support, especially from people who had been so quick to criticize him. But as the applause continued, Darius felt a surge of hope. Dean Thompson stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Mr. Walker, for sharing your perspective. Now, we'll open the floor to questions and comments. We want to hear from everyone." Darius stepped away from the microphone, his heart still pounding, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of accomplishment. He had said what needed to be said, and now the ball was in the university's court. As students lined up to take turns at the microphone, Darius noticed a few familiar faces, some supportive, others skeptical. A few faculty members seemed agitated, but others appeared to be deep in thought. The town hall was only just beginning, but already the conversation had shifted. And Darius knew that things would never be the same again. The days following the town hall were a blur for Darius. The adrenaline from his speech was still coursing through his veins, but with it came a growing sense of uncertainty. He had stood before the entire university and demanded change. The crowd had cheered, but now, as the applause faded into memory, Darius couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much harder. By Thursday afternoon, the campus felt different. The conversations that had once been casual in passing now felt weighted, as if everyone was talking about something they didn't quite understand, but couldn't ignore. Darius walked through the quad, his eyes scanning the various groups of students huddled together in hushed discussions. Some were whispering in support of his speech, while others were muttering about how out of line he had been, accusing him of causing unnecessary drama. He couldn't help but feel a twinge of doubt, wondering if his actions were causing a rift in ways he hadn't anticipated. Later that evening, Darius received a text from Zoe, "You're gonna want to see this." The message came with a link to a university-wide forum post. Darius hesitated before clicking on it, already dreading what he would find. The post was titled, "The Real Problem at Our University, What Darius Walker Won't Tell You." As he read through it, his stomach sank. It was an open letter from a group of professors, those who had publicly disagreed with his stance at the town hall. The post criticized Darius for what they called a reckless and divisive attack on faculty and the integrity of the university. They accused him of creating unnecessary division, and one professor even suggested that his actions were undermining the very values of academic freedom the university prided itself on. Darius clenched his fists as he read the post. It wasn't just a critique of his letter, it was an attempt to discredit him, to silence him by framing his words as an attack on the very principles the university claimed to uphold. His heart raced with anger and frustration. They weren't listening. They didn't care about the real issues. They only cared about their own image. He felt a surge of determination. This was exactly what he had been expecting, a backlash from those in power who felt threatened by the possibility of change. But it didn't scare him. It only made him more resolute. If they wanted a fight, he would give it to them. The next morning, Darius walked into class, his head held high. He had decided that he wasn't going to let the professor's letter define him. But the tension in the room was palpable. The professor, Dr. Simmons, was already at the front of the room, and as Darius took his seat, he noticed the subtle glances from his classmates. Some were still supportive, but others seemed different. He could feel the weight of their judgment on him. It wasn't until the break between classes that the first confrontation came. "Hey, Darius," a voice called from behind him. He turned to find Ethan, a fellow student and member of the debate team, standing with a few other students. Ethan wasn't someone Darius was particularly close with, but the guy had always been friendly enough. Still, the look on his face now was anything but friendly. "I don't know if you saw the post," Ethan said, his tone sharp, "but it's causing a lot of problems. I think you're making a bigger deal out of this than it needs to be. Not everyone agrees with you." Darius felt his jaw tighten. He had expected this, but hearing it from Ethan still stung. "I'm not trying to make a big deal out of it," Darius replied, keeping his voice steady. "I'm just calling out something that's been wrong for far too long." Ethan looked at him like he was speaking a different language. "You're calling out professors who've worked here for years. You're attacking the system that's been in place for decades. It's a mess, Darius. And you might not realize it, but you're creating division. People don't want to deal with that." Darius took a deep breath. "People don't want to deal with the truth, Ethan. But I'm not going to stay quiet anymore. If people want to be comfortable, that's on them. But I'm not going to sit back and let things stay the same." Ethan shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "You'll see. This isn't going to end the way you think it will." The warning felt like a threat, and it left a bitter taste in Darius's mouth. He was ready for the pushback. He had expected it, but the reality of it, the hostility, the resistance, was harder to stomach than he had anticipated. Still, he wasn't about to back down. The tension on campus only escalated in the following days. The professors who had written the forum post were now leading a petition to have Darius's letter removed from circulation. The petition accused him of promoting a toxic atmosphere, one that was detrimental to academic integrity and the university's reputation. Students were either joining the petition or rallying in support of Darius, splitting the campus into two factions. Zoe and Alex noticed the change too. "Have you seen the petition?" Zoe asked one afternoon as they sat in the coffee shop near campus. "They're really going after you now." Darius nodded, feeling a heavy weight settle in his chest. "Yeah, I've seen it. I knew this was coming. I can't say I'm surprised, but it's still a lot to handle." Alex leaned in, his voice quiet. "They're trying to make you look like the bad guy. But you know what? They're scared. They wouldn't be reacting like this if they didn't feel threatened." Darius looked at his friends, his gratitude for their support only growing. "I know. But it doesn't make it any easier. It's like they're trying to turn the whole campus against me." Zoe's eyes softened with understanding. "Don't let them win. Keep pushing. The fact that they're so angry means you're getting through to them. You're making them uncomfortable, and that's exactly what we need." As much as Darius wanted to take comfort in Zoe's words, the truth was that the pressure was starting to take its toll. The constant stress of the backlash, the endless debates with classmates, and the growing isolation were beginning to wear him down. But no matter how hard it got, he knew he couldn't stop now. Too much was at stake, not just for him, but for every student who had ever felt silenced or overlooked. The next battle was going to be even tougher. The professors were now calling for a formal hearing with the administration, hoping to have Darius formally reprimanded for his actions. The gloves were off. And Darius wasn't backing down. The day of the formal hearing arrived faster than Darius had anticipated. He had been preparing for it, but as he stood in front of the administration building, his mind was a whirlwind of anxiety and determination. This was the moment. The moment when everything he had been fighting for would either make or break his resolve. The hearing wasn't just about him. It was about every student who had been ignored, every voice that had been silenced. Darius stepped into the building, flanked by Zoe and Alex, who had offered to accompany him for moral support. His palms were slick with sweat, and his mind raced. He had never imagined that he'd be walking into a formal hearing like this. To be called into question for speaking out, for demanding change, it felt wrong on so many levels, but also undeniably necessary. They entered the large, sterile conference room, where several administrators sat waiting for them. At the head of the table sat Dean Thompson, the same man who had introduced the town hall. His expression was unreadable, but there was something about the way he sat that made Darius feel like he was already being judged. Around the table were several professors, including Professor Carter, whose eyes met Darius's with a cold, hard stare. It was clear that Carter was here for one reason, to make sure Darius's words were held accountable. "Mr. Walker," Dean Thompson began, his voice firm but not unfriendly, "thank you for coming today. We've called this hearing to discuss the letter you wrote and the events that followed. As you know, your actions have raised serious concerns, both from faculty members and some members of the student body. We need to determine whether your actions are in line with the university's values and policies." Darius took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. This was it. He was no longer just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of authority. "I understand," Darius said, his voice surprisingly steady. "But I'm here to speak the truth. And the truth is, the university has a problem, a big one. It's not just about me. It's about the system that continues to overlook the struggles of students of color, that continues to protect those who perpetuate harmful stereotypes and microaggressions. I'm not here to attack anyone. I'm here to make sure that something changes." Dean Thompson's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, but he gave a small nod. "We understand your position, Mr. Walker. However, your approach, specifically the letter you wrote, has led to divisiveness. We need to understand whether your actions were intended to incite unrest or if they were meant to start a dialogue. I didn't intend to incite unrest, Darius replied, his gaze steady as he looked around the room. But I do believe that the university has become complacent, and inaction is just as harmful as outright hostility. We need to confront these issues, not just talk about them in private. The whole campus needs to hear this, needs to see what's happening. If that causes division, so be it. But at least we'll be talking about something that matters. Professor Carter, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat and leaned forward. Mr. Walker, he said, his tone clipped, it's one thing to express concerns, but it's quite another to make sweeping accusations against the faculty. Your letter suggested that professors like myself are complicit in a system of oppression. That is a serious charge. How do you justify that? Darius met Carter's gaze head-on, refusing to look away. I didn't accuse you specifically, Professor Carter. But I did accuse the system. And the reality is that the system protects those in power and silences those who speak up. I'm not saying every professor is guilty of racism, but many, yourself included, play a part in upholding a culture that marginalizes students of color. The room fell silent. Darius could feel the weight of their eyes on him, but he didn't flinch. Zoe gave him a subtle nod of encouragement from the back of the room. I'm not here to make enemies, Darius continued. But I also can't sit back and pretend that the problem isn't real. It's easy for those in positions of power to say that there's no problem, that things are fine. But for students like me, who deal with racism, discrimination, and microaggressions every day, the problems are very real. The fact that you can't even see that is the very reason why change needs to happen. A few of the administrators exchanged looks, but no one spoke. Darius knew that his words had struck a nerve. The truth was uncomfortable for them. But it had to be said. Dean Thompson finally broke the silence. I see. But Mr. Walker, there are other ways to bring attention to these issues. The way you've gone about this, by publicly attacking faculty members, by stirring up tensions, has caused damage. The university cannot condone actions that disrupt the academic environment and make students or faculty feel unsafe. Darius felt his pulse quicken. Unsafe? I didn't make anyone unsafe. I've felt unsafe for years. It's the students of color who walk into classrooms every day, wondering if we'll be dismissed, if we'll be judged, if we'll be ignored. We've been marginalized for too long. But instead of listening to our voices, we're being told that we've caused the division. That we're the ones making things uncomfortable. The reality is that the discomfort is necessary. It's the only way change will come. Professor Carter's face reddened, and for a moment, Darius thought he might snap. But Carter remained silent, his gaze fixed firmly on the table. The other professors in the room shifted uncomfortably, but Darius could tell they were beginning to understand. He wasn't going to back down. There were several more questions, but Darius stood his ground, answering them as calmly as he could, no matter how pointed they were. Each one felt like another small victory. He could feel the tide beginning to shift, just slightly, but it was enough. Finally, the hearing came to an end. Dean Thompson stood and addressed the group. Thank you, Mr. Walker. We will take everything into consideration and make a decision regarding your letter and its impact on the university's policies. This meeting is adjourned. As Darius walked out of the room, his heart was pounding, but a sense of triumph surged through him. He had said what needed to be said, and though he knew the fight wasn't over, this was a significant step. Zoe and Alex were waiting for him outside the conference room. You did it, Darius, Zoe said, her face alight with pride. Darius smiled faintly. It's not over yet. But I'm not backing down. No matter what. The morning after the hearing, Darius felt strangely calm. He had expected to feel exhausted, but instead, he woke up with a sense of clarity that hadn't been there before. The hearing had been intense, a battlefield where the stakes were high, but the fight wasn't over. It wasn't just about one hearing, it was about something much bigger. Darius stood at the window of his dorm room, looking out over the sprawling campus. The trees were still covered in a delicate frost from the previous night's chill, and the distant hum of students walking to class echoed through the air. He took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. No matter what the administration decided, he knew that the fight was far from finished. That afternoon, Darius sat in the student union, sipping his coffee as he read through the responses that had been flooding his inbox. Many were supportive, offering encouragement and praise for his bravery. A few even asked how they could help, whether by attending future rallies or organizing student-led discussions about racial inequality on campus. These messages warmed Darius's heart, but they were also a stark reminder of how divisive the situation had become. In contrast, there were others that felt more like daggers. Emails from anonymous students questioning his character, accusing him of being a troublemaker, or worse, a divisive force on campus. Darius had learned long ago to take these with a grain of salt. He'd seen how power structures worked, how they tried to use fear to keep people quiet. But it still hurt. The backlash from his fellow students, especially those who were too afraid to stand with him, was difficult to ignore. Zoe and Alex had been by his side through it all. They were the ones who helped him sift through the overwhelming feedback, both positive and negative. They were the ones who had supported him when things felt like they were spiraling out of control. But even they were starting to feel the pressure. "I had to walk past a group of students this morning, and they were talking about you," Zoe said, her voice tight with frustration as she slid into the chair across from Darius. "They were saying some pretty awful things. I mean, you know it's bad when even the people you thought were allies are starting to pull away." "I know," Darius replied, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of the situation. "I've heard the whispers too. It's not easy, but it's part of this fight. People are uncomfortable. They don't like change. But if we want things to be different, we have to keep pushing." Alex leaned forward, glancing at Zoe before returning his gaze to Darius. "The thing is, Darius, this is going to keep getting worse before it gets better. You're challenging the system. And systems don't like being challenged. But I believe in you. And I think, no, I know, that this is only the beginning." Darius nodded, appreciating his friend's words of encouragement, even though part of him was beginning to wonder just how much longer he could carry this weight. That evening, the university issued an official statement about the hearing. The administration's response was predictably tepid. Dean Thompson emphasized the importance of academic freedom, claiming that the university upheld its commitment to open dialogue, but he also reaffirmed that Darius's actions had caused disruption and discontent. The statement did not explicitly mention any repercussions for Darius, but it was clear that the administration was walking a fine line, trying to appease both sides without truly committing to any significant change. The lack of a clear resolution felt like a slap in the face. Darius had hoped for something stronger, something more decisive. But as he read through the carefully crafted words of the statement, it was clear that the administration was trying to play both sides. They didn't want to alienate the faculty and staff who had opposed him, but they also didn't want to silence him completely, for fear of further escalating the situation. The statement was an empty gesture, and Darius knew it. But he wasn't about to let it go unanswered. He'd taken the first step by speaking up, and now he needed to keep that momentum going. The campus needed to feel the full weight of the issues he was fighting for. The next few days were a blur of protests, sit-ins, and student-led forums. The students who had been on the fence were slowly starting to take sides. Darius could see it in their faces, the divide was becoming more pronounced. On one side, there were those who were finally beginning to speak out, who were willing to challenge the administration, to question the status quo. On the other side, there were those who still clung to the belief that things were fine, that the university was working to improve, that the problems Darius spoke of were either exaggerated or not as urgent as he made them out to be. Darius walked into one of the student forums a week later, his heart pounding in his chest. He'd been invited to speak alongside a few other student leaders who were also passionate about creating change on campus. The forum was meant to be a space for open dialogue, but Darius knew that it was more than that. It was a chance to rally the students, to remind them of why they were fighting in the first place. As he took the podium, the room grew quiet, all eyes turning toward him. He wasn't prepared for the wave of emotions that hit him as he stood there, facing a room full of students who were listening, not just to his words, but to his message. It felt like the entire campus was hanging on his every word. "I know many of you are tired of hearing about what happened," Darius began, his voice calm but firm. "I know it's uncomfortable. I know it's divisive. But let's be clear about one thing, we're not going to fix this problem by pretending it doesn't exist. We're not going to make progress by staying silent and waiting for someone else to solve it for us. We have to speak up. We have to challenge the systems that are in place, even if that means facing backlash. This fight is bigger than me, bigger than any one person, it's about all of us." There was a pause, a collective breath that seemed to linger in the air. Then, someone from the back of the room stood up. It was a student Darius had never seen before, a freshman who had been silent up until now. "Darius, I'm with you," the student said, their voice trembling slightly but filled with conviction. "I've seen what's going on here. I've seen how things are, and I can't pretend like it's all fine anymore. You're right. It's not just about you, or about any of us individually. It's about all of us." The room erupted in applause, and Darius felt a wave of relief flood through him. There were more students willing to stand up, to demand change, and to support him in ways that felt real and tangible. This was the beginning of something. Darius sat in his favorite spot in the student union, scrolling through his phone and reading the latest news about the ongoing protests and forums. The campus was alive with tension, but it was also filled with an energy he hadn't expected, a sense of purpose that was now taking root among the students. His efforts hadn't been in vain. He had sparked something, and it was spreading like wildfire. But as much as he felt validated by the support of his peers, Darius knew that things were far from over. The administration was still circling, still trying to figure out how to handle the situation without fully committing to any kind of real change. And then, something happened that he hadn't anticipated. It was just after noon when Darius received an unexpected email. The subject line read, "Request for meeting, Dean Thompson's office." His heart skipped a beat. Dean Thompson. Wasn't he the one who had been so dismissive during the hearing? Wasn't he the one who had sent out that lukewarm statement about the protests? Why would he want to meet with Darius now? He clicked open the email. The message was short and to the point. "Mr. Walker, I would like to schedule a meeting with you to discuss some recent developments. Please come to my office at 2:30 p.m. today." At first, Darius didn't know what to think. He had expected more opposition from the administration, not an invitation to meet. The email wasn't threatening or condescending, but it wasn't exactly friendly either. Still, he couldn't afford to ignore it. He grabbed his jacket and made his way to Dean Thompson's office. As he walked through the halls of the administration building, Darius felt a mixture of anticipation and wariness. What could Dean Thompson possibly want? Had the hearing not been enough for the administration to make their decision? Or was something else going on? When Darius reached the office, he was greeted by a secretary who directed him to a small waiting area just outside the dean's office. He could hear the soft hum of conversation and the occasional shuffle of papers from inside. The air felt thick with expectation. Minutes later, the door opened, and Dean Thompson stepped out. He had a neutral expression on his face, but his eyes seemed focused, as if he had something important to say. "Mr. Walker," he said, his voice calm but measured, "thank you for coming." "Of course," Darius replied, trying to keep his tone even despite the nervous flutter in his chest. "You said you wanted to meet." Dean Thompson gestured for Darius to follow him inside. The office was modest, with bookshelves lining the walls and a large oak desk sitting in the center of the room. As Darius took a seat across from the dean, the silence was palpable. It was almost as if both men were waiting for the other to speak first. Finally, Dean Thompson broke the silence. "I've been following the developments on campus closely," he said, leaning forward slightly. "The protests, the forums, you've certainly stirred something in the student body. And I won't deny that it's made me reconsider a few things." Darius raised an eyebrow. "Reconsider? What do you mean?" Dean Thompson sighed, as if choosing his words carefully. "Look, I know this has been difficult for everyone. The university is not perfect, and I'm not here to pretend it is. There's a long-standing history here, and change is never easy. But what you've done, what you've started, isn't something we can ignore." Darius sat up straighter. This was not the response he had been expecting. "So, what are you saying? Are you telling me that you're finally going to do something about it? About the racial inequality, the microaggressions, the way the administration has handled all of this?" Dean Thompson paused, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "We've been discussing some of these issues at the higher levels of the administration. We've realized that there needs to be more dialogue, not just between the students and faculty, but within the administration itself. There are policies that need to be reviewed, and there are attitudes that need to be addressed. And frankly, your actions have pushed us into a corner where we can no longer ignore the truth." Darius blinked, trying to process the gravity of what Dean Thompson was saying. "Are you saying that you're willing to listen? Actually listen to the students? And to make real changes?" Dean Thompson nodded, but his expression was still guarded. "I'm not saying it will happen overnight. Change takes time. But I'm prepared to meet with you, with other student leaders, and even with some of the faculty who have been vocal about their concerns. We need to find common ground. This can't just be a one-sided conversation." Darius felt a rush of cautious optimism. It was more than he had hoped for, but he couldn't let himself get too excited. He had seen how things like this could go south. "And what about Professor Carter?" Darius asked, his voice steady. "Is he going to be a part of this discussion?" Dean Thompson's face tightened at the mention of Professor Carter's name. "Carter is a well-respected member of the faculty, and his views are valuable, even if they differ from yours. I won't say that he will automatically be receptive to these changes, but he will be involved in the discussions moving forward." Darius nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the conversation pressing on him. "I appreciate you saying that, but I'm not sure how much change will come if people like him are still in charge. He's part of the problem, not the solution." The dean's expression softened slightly. "I understand your frustration, Darius. Believe me, I do. But change often begins with difficult conversations. We won't know what's possible until we have those conversations." Darius took a deep breath. He knew this was only the beginning. "I'm willing to talk," he said, "but I need to see action. Real, tangible change." Dean Thompson leaned back in his chair, looking at Darius with a kind of reluctant respect. "I understand. And I'm prepared to listen. We'll schedule another meeting in the coming days, and we'll bring in some faculty and students who are willing to engage in this dialogue. But I need you to understand, this will not be easy. Not everyone will agree with your perspective, but we'll have to find a way to make this work." Darius stood up, feeling a mix of wariness and hope. "I'll be there. But I won't back down. Not now." As Darius left Dean Thompson's office, he felt a strange sense of resolve settle over him. This meeting had been unexpected, but it wasn't a victory, not yet. There was still a long road ahead, and he had to stay vigilant. The administration might be willing to listen, but Darius knew that the real challenge would be getting them to act. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The days following Darius's unexpected meeting with Dean Thompson were filled with a mix of nervous anticipation and intense preparation. The promise of a formal dialogue between the administration, faculty, and students had set a new course for Darius's fight, but he knew that it wasn't going to be easy. Dean Thompson's words rang in his head, "This will not be easy. Not everyone will agree with your perspective." Darius spent the next few days coordinating with Zoe, Alex, and other student leaders who had been involved in the protests and forums. They needed to make sure that their voices were heard loud and clear during this upcoming meeting. It wasn't just about getting their concerns addressed, it was about making sure that the change they were demanding was not just a superficial gesture, but something that would create real, lasting impact on campus. They gathered at their usual study spot in the library, a quiet corner where they could strategize without interruption. The mood was different this time. It wasn't just about reacting to the administration's failure to act, it was about pushing for something better. Something concrete. "I can't believe we're actually having this meeting," Zoe said, looking up from her notebook. "It feels like everything we've been doing has led up to this moment." "It's big, no doubt," Alex added, tapping his fingers on the table nervously. "But we have to be careful. The administration isn't just going to hand us everything we want. They'll try to appease us without making any real changes. We need to push harder." Darius nodded, his mind already racing through the potential outcomes of the meeting. "I agree. We need to have our demands in place. We need to go in there with a clear plan. If we let them control the narrative, nothing will change. We can't let them get away with giving us the same old excuses." They began to outline their goals for the meeting. The first and most important issue was clear: accountability. They needed to make sure that the administration took full responsibility for the racial inequalities and discriminatory practices that had been present on campus. It wasn't just about Professor Carter's actions, it was about the system as a whole, and how it had allowed such behavior to go unchecked for so long. Zoe scribbled down their first demand on the board. Mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all faculty and staff. Not just a one-time workshop, Darius added, but ongoing education. The kind of training that will actually change behavior, not just check off a box. We need real accountability. Alex raised his hand, his expression serious. And we need better support systems for students of color. We're not just asking for a diversity seminar and calling it a day. There needs to be a permanent support structure, mentorship programs, counseling services, and resources for students who face discrimination. Darius nodded. Exactly. We also need a formal review process for complaints of racial discrimination. Something that's transparent and independent of the departments involved. If students don't feel safe reporting incidents, how can we expect any change? The team continued to brainstorm, coming up with additional points to bring up in the meeting. But one thing was clear: the university could no longer afford to ignore the voices of the students, especially the ones who had been marginalized for far too long. It wasn't just about making demands, it was about creating a future where every student felt safe and respected. As they finalized their list of goals, Darius's phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up and saw a text message from his mother. It read, "I'm proud of you, Darius. Keep fighting for what's right. But remember, it's not always about winning. It's about making sure your voice is heard and that you stand for something greater than yourself." His heart swelled at the words. His mother had always been a source of strength for him, especially in moments of doubt. She was right. This wasn't just about winning, it was about making sure that future students wouldn't have to fight the same battles. The day of the meeting arrived, and Darius felt a knot in his stomach as he walked toward the administration building. He had been mentally preparing for this moment for weeks, but now that it was finally here, the weight of the situation felt heavier than ever. He was about to face a room full of powerful people, administrators, faculty members, and others who held the keys to the university's future. And he wasn't sure what to expect. Would they listen? Would they take him seriously? He walked into the conference room with Zoe and Alex at his side, and as they sat down, Darius noticed a few familiar faces. There was Dean Thompson, of course, looking as neutral as ever. Beside him sat a few senior faculty members, Dr. Hughes, the chair of the history department, and Professor Montgomery, a well-respected figure in the sociology department. Darius had heard their names mentioned during some of the forums, mostly in a positive light. It seemed that they were among the few faculty members who were genuinely interested in listening to the students. But then there was Professor Carter, sitting at the far end of the table, his face unreadable. Darius couldn't help but feel a sense of discomfort as their eyes met. He still couldn't shake the memory of the way the professor had spoken to him in class, the mocking tone in his voice. It was clear that Carter was not there to apologize or make amends. He was there to defend his position, to argue that his actions had been justified. Darius took a deep breath, trying to center himself. This was it. The moment they had all been working toward. The stakes were higher than ever. Dean Thompson opened the meeting with a few brief remarks, acknowledging the tensions on campus and emphasizing the importance of having a candid conversation. He then looked directly at Darius. "Mr. Walker," the dean said, "thank you for agreeing to meet with us today. I understand that you have some concerns, and we're here to listen. Please, share your thoughts." Darius stood up, his heart pounding. This was his moment. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, waiting to see what he would say. He had prepared for this, but now that he was standing there, the words felt heavier than ever. "Thank you, Dean Thompson," Darius began, his voice steady but strong. "I'm here today because I believe that the university has failed its students, especially students of color. For too long, we've been ignored, marginalized, and forced to accept a system that doesn't value us. We've been told that our voices don't matter, that our experiences don't count. But that stops today." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. The silence was thick, and for a moment, Darius wondered if they were even listening. But he continued, pushing forward. "We need accountability. We need diversity and inclusion training that goes beyond a simple seminar. We need a system that supports students of color, from mentorship programs to counseling services. And we need a formal, independent review process for complaints of discrimination. This is not negotiable." The room was quiet as Darius sat down, his heart racing. He had said what he needed to say, but the real challenge lay ahead. Would they listen? Would they act? Dean Thompson nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "We hear you, Mr. Walker," he said. "And we will take your concerns seriously. This is not a conversation that ends here. We will begin working on a plan to address these issues." Darius didn't know what to expect next, but one thing was clear: the battle had only just begun. The meeting had barely begun when the first sign of resistance showed itself. Darius had hoped that the administration's willingness to listen was a genuine step toward change. But now, sitting in the conference room surrounded by the very people who had kept the status quo in place for so long, he could feel the tension beginning to build. This was no longer just a conversation, it was a battle. Dean Thompson had just nodded in agreement with Darius's opening statement, but now the real discussion was underway. It was time to dive into the specifics of what needed to be done, and already, the first signs of resistance were beginning to emerge. "We understand your concerns, Mr. Walker," Dean Thompson said, his voice steady but cautious. "But I want to remind everyone here that implementing such changes requires careful consideration. These things take time. We can't expect immediate results." Darius clenched his jaw, feeling a wave of frustration rise within him. This was the same line he had heard from the administration time and time again: change takes time. But how much more time could they afford to waste? The students had been waiting for far too long. "I don't think we're asking for the impossible here," Darius replied, his voice firm. "We're asking for action, not excuses. We need real change, and we need it now." You can't keep using the "it takes time" excuse when lives are being affected by these issues every single day. Zoe, who had been sitting quietly next to Darius, leaned forward in her chair. We're talking about students being subjected to racist behavior, to microaggressions, to feeling unsafe on this campus. This isn't something that can wait. We need a commitment, and we need it now. Professor Carter, who had been sitting at the far end of the table with his arms crossed, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His face remained neutral, but Darius could see the tension in his posture. This was not a man who was ready to concede anything. I think we all agree that racism and discrimination have no place on this campus, Professor Carter finally spoke up, his tone cool and somewhat dismissive. But I also think we need to acknowledge that these are deeply ingrained issues. They can't be fixed overnight with a few policies and workshops. We have to consider the long-term impact of any changes we make. Darius felt a spark of anger flare up inside him. Professor Carter's words were dripping with condescension. It was as if he was implying that the students' pain, their struggle, was just another academic theory to be debated rather than something that required immediate, tangible action. With all due respect, Professor, Darius said, his voice steady but sharp, students of color aren't some abstract concept. Our experiences are real. The harm we face isn't theoretical, it's something we deal with every day. You can sit here and talk about long-term impact all you want, but we're the ones who are living through it. A heavy silence settled over the room. For a moment, Darius wasn't sure if he had crossed a line. But then Dean Thompson spoke again, trying to regain control of the conversation. I think what Professor Carter is trying to say, Dean Thompson interjected, is that we have to approach this issue in a way that balances urgency with feasibility. We don't want to rush into changes that might have unintended consequences. Darius felt his frustration bubbling up again. Unintended consequences, he repeated incredulously. What consequences are we talking about here? People being allowed to continue to be racist? People being made to feel like they don't belong? What exactly are we supposed to wait for before we make real change? Dean Thompson's brow furrowed. I'm not suggesting that we ignore the issues at hand. But we have to approach this in a manner that ensures lasting results. We can't make hasty decisions that could undermine the credibility of the university or leave us exposed to legal challenges. The words, legal challenges, hung in the air like a warning. Darius understood that this was the administration's tactic: stall for time, cloak everything in bureaucracy, and make it seem like any meaningful change was too risky or too difficult to implement. We're not asking for drastic, unconsidered changes, Zoe said, her voice calm but resolute. We're asking for tangible action. For concrete steps that will make this campus safer for everyone, regardless of their race. Dr. Hughes, who had been silent up until this point, spoke up. What Zoe and Darius are suggesting is important, but we also have to consider the broader context. The institution itself has its own set of challenges: budget constraints, resource limitations, and the fact that not all faculty members are in agreement about the scope of these changes. We need to take all these factors into account. Darius felt his blood pressure rise as Dr. Hughes continued to speak. It was the same old line: we have budget constraints. We need more time. We need to consider the bigger picture. All of these excuses had been used to silence students for years, and Darius was tired of hearing them. This isn't about budgets or resources. Darius finally said, his voice rising. This is about people's lives. We're asking for a commitment to change, and we won't accept anything less. If you can't make the changes now, if you're going to keep telling us that it's too complicated or too risky, then what are we even doing here? Dean Thompson looked at Darius for a long moment before sighing. Mr. Walker, we're not trying to dismiss your concerns. But we have to be realistic about what we can do and how fast we can do it. If we move too quickly, we risk pushing people away who might otherwise be willing to work with us. It was a tactic Darius had seen before, the compromise strategy. It wasn't about solving the problem, it was about placating people without making real change. He could see where this was headed, and it wasn't good. This isn't about compromise, Darius said firmly. This is about justice. And you can't compromise on justice. The room fell silent again, the weight of Darius's words hanging in the air. For a brief moment, it felt like the administration wasn't sure how to respond. But then, to Darius's surprise, it was Professor Montgomery who spoke up. Maybe it's time we stop playing it safe, Professor Montgomery said, his voice measured but thoughtful. Maybe we need to take some risks if we're truly committed to making change. I've been listening to what the students are saying, and it's clear that the time for small steps is over. We need to be bold. Darius blinked, surprised by Professor Montgomery's sudden shift in tone. He had expected resistance from all corners, but here was a faculty member who was actually willing to acknowledge the urgency of the situation. Dean Thompson seemed taken aback, but he quickly regained his composure. I appreciate your perspective, Professor Montgomery. But we must proceed cautiously. Change can't come at the expense of a university's integrity. Darius looked around the room, sensing the divide. Some were willing to listen, others weren't. The meeting had only just begun, but it was already clear that the fight for real change was going to be harder than he had ever imagined. It had been 3 days since the heated meeting with the administration, and Darius could still feel the tension in the air. He walked across campus, his mind preoccupied with everything that had been said, and everything that had been left unsaid. Despite the progress that had been made in getting the administration to acknowledge the need for change, it was clear that real action would be a long time coming. Dean Thompson's promises were nothing more than empty words, and the faculty members who had shown some support were, for the most part, silent now. Darius knew the fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. The campus, however, was changing. The students were waking up. He could see it everywhere he went. Small groups were forming in the corners of the student union, in classrooms, and in dormitory lounges. People who had once remained on the sidelines were now stepping up, determined to make their voices heard. It was Zoe who called Darius that evening, her voice urgent on the other end of the phone. We need to talk. Meet me at the student center. It's happening tonight. Darius's heart raced. What's going on? What's happening tonight? We're organizing a protest. We're not waiting for the administration anymore. We're taking action, Zoe said, her tone filled with a mix of determination and excitement. We've got people already working on the logistics. It's time to stop asking and start demanding. You in? Darius didn't even hesitate. I'm in. I'll be there. As he made his way to the student center, Darius couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that had happened over the past few days. The tension was palpable, and the air seemed to hum with anticipation. The students were ready to fight, not just for themselves, but for all the others who had been silenced and marginalized for far too long. When he arrived, Zoe was already there, talking to a small group of students. They all looked determined, their faces set with purpose. It was clear that this wasn't just a one-off protest, it was the beginning of something bigger. Darius could feel it. This was their moment. The spark had been lit. You've got a good crowd here, Darius said, nodding to the group of students who were already working on signs and banners. It's only the beginning, Zoe said, her eyes lighting up. We're planning a walkout tomorrow. We're going to take over the quad during lunch hour. We need as many people as possible to show up. The administration thinks they can just ignore us, but they're about to find out that we won't be ignored anymore. The plan was simple but powerful. They would gather in the quad at noon the following day, holding signs, chanting, and demanding action from the administration. The goal wasn't just to make noise. It was to show the university that the student body was united in their demands for justice. They needed to disrupt the normal flow of campus life, to make it impossible for the administration to keep pretending that everything was fine. Do you think the administration will respond? Darius asked, his voice filled with concern. He knew they would face resistance, and he was prepared for it, but he still had his doubts. Zoe looked him in the eye, her expression hardening. We can't keep waiting for them to come to us. This is the only way. They need to see that we're serious. The time for polite requests is over. It's time for them to hear us. Darius nodded, feeling the weight of her words sink in. This wasn't just about changing policies, it was about showing the world that they weren't going to back down. The administration had underestimated their resolve, and now, it was time to prove them wrong. The next day, the quad was a sea of students. By noon, the space was packed with young people, all of them holding signs demanding racial justice, equality, and accountability from the administration. The air was electric, charged with an intensity that Darius had never felt before. This wasn't just a protest, it was a movement. As Darius looked around, he saw the diversity of the crowd, black, white, Latinx, Asian, and students of all backgrounds standing together in solidarity. Some held signs that read, "No justice, no peace," others held posters with the faces of students who had been victims of discrimination. There were chants, there were speeches, and there was a collective sense of purpose that seemed to reverberate through the entire campus. At the front of the crowd, Zoe stood tall, leading the chants. "What do we want?" she called out. "Justice." "When do we want it?" the crowd responded. "Now." The energy was infectious. Students who had never been involved in activism before were raising their voices, their presence a testament to the power of unity. Darius stood near the back of the crowd, taking it all in. It was incredible to see how far they had come. They had started with a few small voices, and now they were a force to be reckoned with. But it wasn't just the students who had noticed. Word had spread quickly, and soon, campus security arrived in full force. Darius could see the officers standing at the perimeter, their eyes scanning the crowd, waiting for any sign of trouble. It was clear that the administration had been caught off guard. Dean Thompson, along with several other administrators, stood off to the side, watching the protest unfold. Darius could see the discomfort on their faces. They hadn't expected this, at least, not so soon. But there was no turning back now. The students had made their point. They weren't going to wait around for the administration to get around to fixing the problem. They were taking matters into their own hands. The protest continued for hours, and Darius could feel the weight of every chant, every movement, every word of defiance. This wasn't just about him, Zoe, or the other students leading the charge, it was about every person who had ever been made to feel invisible on this campus. It was about the history of racism that had been swept under the rug for too long, and about the hope that, finally, real change was possible. But even as the protest raged on, Darius knew this was just the beginning. The real challenge was still ahead of them. They had made their voices heard, but would the administration listen? Would they follow through with the changes they had promised? And what about the students who were still hesitant, who hadn't yet found their voice? Darius knew that the fight wasn't just about getting attention, it was about building momentum, about keeping the pressure on until the administration had no choice but to act. The protest had reached a new level of intensity. What had started as a spontaneous outpouring of frustration had now become a full-blown movement. The quad was filled with students chanting, waving signs, and demanding accountability from the administration. Darius felt the pulse of energy coursing through him, but he also felt the pressure mounting. They had made an undeniable statement, but the real challenge was what came next. Despite their growing numbers, the administration was clearly not backing down. Security had increased, and now campus police were stationed at every exit of the quad, watching the students with wary eyes. The tension in the air was palpable, but the students were resolute. For every officer who stood silently at the edge of the crowd, there were 20 students shouting, refusing to be silenced. Darius could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about him anymore. This wasn't about one student's experience or even about one professor's insult. This was about every student who had been marginalized and silenced for years, decades, even. It was about standing up for something that had been overlooked for far too long. Zoe stood next to him, her eyes scanning the crowd. Her usual fire was even more intense now, as if she could feel the movement itself fueling her. She was in her element, but even she knew the next steps would be critical. "We've got to keep the pressure on," Zoe said, her voice barely audible above the chants. "We can't let them brush this off as just a protest. This is a movement. It's bigger than us, Darius. We've already made history today, but now we need to make sure they can't ignore us tomorrow." Darius nodded. Zoe was right. Today's protest was only the beginning of what would be a much longer, much more difficult battle. The administration had underestimated their resolve, and now, they had no choice but to respond. But what would that response look like? Darius had a sinking feeling that the administration wouldn't be willing to just give in. They would fight back, and the students would need to be ready for it. The next day, as Darius sat in the student union, going over the plans for the following day's events, a familiar figure approached him. It was Professor Montgomery, the one faculty member who had shown real support for the student movement. Darius felt a mixture of surprise and relief as Montgomery sat down across from him, his expression thoughtful. "We need to talk," Montgomery said quietly. "The administration's response is coming. I've heard whispers, and it doesn't look good." Darius's heart sank. He had expected resistance, but hearing it confirmed made it all the more real. "What are they planning?" Darius asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "They're going to start by discrediting you. They'll try to frame this as an isolated incident, something that doesn't require a university-wide overhaul. They'll call the protest disruptive and claim that the students are overreacting." Darius clenched his fists under the table. He had been waiting for this moment, but hearing it from Montgomery made it feel inevitable. "So, they're going to try to spin it as if we're the problem, not the institution?" Montgomery nodded. "Exactly. They're going to push the narrative that the university is doing all it can, and that what happened in your class was a misunderstanding. They'll frame this as a matter of personal bias, not systemic failure." Zoe walked over to the table just then, and she caught the tail end of the conversation. "Are they really going to do that?" she asked, disbelief in her voice. "Unfortunately, yes," Montgomery said, his voice grim. "They'll try to make you all look like troublemakers. They'll say the protest is a distraction from real academic concerns. They'll try to make it about you, not the issue at hand." Zoe's jaw clenched. "They think they can just ignore us and sweep this under the rug. They're wrong." "I know," Darius said, his voice steady now. "And they'll learn that soon enough. If they want to play that game, we'll make sure they don't get away with it." Montgomery looked at both of them with a serious expression. "Just remember, this will be a long fight. They won't give up easily. You'll have to keep up the pressure. And you'll need more allies than just the students who've shown up at the protests." Darius was already planning ahead. "We'll get the faculty on our side. If they're going to play that card, we'll turn it on them. We'll make them realize that their actions aren't just hurting us, they're hurting the whole university." Montgomery nodded slowly. "Be careful, though. The administration is skilled at playing political games. They won't hesitate to throw someone under the bus if it means protecting their reputation." As Montgomery stood to leave, he placed a hand on Darius's shoulder. "I believe in what you're doing. Just don't let them wear you down. The change you're fighting for is worth it. I'll do what I can on my end to help, but you have to be ready for the storm." Darius watched him walk away, feeling a surge of determination. Montgomery's words hit him harder than he expected. It wasn't just about making a point anymore. It wasn't just about standing up for himself. This was about something much bigger. The storm Montgomery had warned about arrived sooner than anyone expected. That afternoon, a university-wide email went out from the office of Dean Thompson. It was short and to the point, a statement addressing the protests that had erupted across campus. The message framed the protests as disruptions to the normal operation of the university, and suggested that the concerns raised by the students would be taken seriously, but that the campus needed to focus on creating a respectful and constructive dialogue. The wording was careful, calculated. Dean Thompson had made it clear that the administration did not condone the protests, but he also wanted to appear as if he were open to discussion. In reality, Darius knew, it was a maneuver to placate the students while simultaneously trying to discredit them. The response was swift. Zoe immediately sent out a rallying cry through social media. "They're trying to shut us down. Let's show them we're not going anywhere. Tomorrow, we keep fighting. Meet us in the quad." It didn't take long for word to spread. By the next morning, the quad was even more crowded than before. Students were standing shoulder to shoulder, holding their signs high, chanting louder than ever before. But this time, things were different. Darius could feel it. The tension in the air was heavier, more palpable. This wasn't just a protest now, it was a confrontation. "We've got to make sure they hear us," Zoe said, her voice resolute. "This is the moment. We can't back down." Darius felt a surge of resolve. This was bigger than one professor's insult. This was about the future of the university, about the very principles it claimed to uphold. As the protest began again, with chants echoing across the campus, Darius knew one thing for sure: the administration might try to shut them down, but they couldn't silence the truth. The morning after their massive protest in the quad, Darius couldn't shake the buzz of excitement and anxiety that filled his body. It was a strange sensation, one that was equal parts exhilarating and terrifying. The student body had not only come together in unprecedented numbers but had managed to make their voices heard. The administration's response had been swift, as expected, an email attempting to downplay the protest, framing it as a mere distraction. But it didn't matter. The students weren't backing down. Darius sat in the library, his eyes scanning through his textbooks, but he couldn't focus. The words on the page blurred, as if the entire world outside the library windows had taken on a new, heightened significance. The protests, the chants, the student-led calls for action, they were all part of something far bigger than any of them had anticipated. Zoe texted him later that morning, her message brief but pointed: "We've got a meeting at 2 p.m. in the student union. It's time to organize the next steps. Big things are happening." Darius didn't need any more prompting. He grabbed his things, pushing aside the doubts that lingered in his mind. As he walked across campus, he noticed a change in the atmosphere. Students were talking more openly about the protests, and many seemed energized, not afraid to speak out about the injustices they had witnessed or experienced. When he entered the student union, the place was packed. Students were everywhere. Sitting at tables, standing in small groups, discussing strategy. Zoe was at the front of the room, speaking animatedly to a group of students who were taking notes, preparing for something bigger. "We need to keep the momentum going," Zoe said as Darius approached. Her voice was filled with urgency. "The administration won't give up easily. If anything, they're going to try to squash this protest before it grows too large. But we're not stopping. Not now. We're in this for the long haul." Darius nodded. "What's the plan?" Zoe motioned to the group. "We've got to take this beyond just the quad. We need a coordinated response. We're organizing a sit-in at the administration building tomorrow. We'll block the entrance, demand a meeting with the board. And we're bringing in outside support, professors, alumni, media." A wave of excitement swept through the room. The students seemed eager, ready to act. But Darius could feel the weight of the next step. A sit-in would escalate things in a way that couldn't be undone. This was no longer a small protest, it was a direct challenge to the institution itself. "What do you need from me?" Darius asked, his voice steady, even though a pit had formed in his stomach. Zoe looked at him, her eyes reflecting the fire that had been building in her for days. "We need you to speak at the sit-in tomorrow. We need your story. Your voice. This whole movement started because of what happened to you in that classroom. If we're going to make the administration listen, we need to show them that this is not just about one professor or one insult. It's about the culture here. It's about the system that's allowed this to go on for years. Darius hesitated for a moment, thinking of the professor, the microaggressions, the dismissive comments that had led to this point. "I'm in," he said finally, the words coming easier now. "Let's do it." The next day, the sit-in was unlike anything Darius had seen. By noon, students had gathered outside the administration building, signs in hand, ready for the confrontation. Security was on high alert. Campus police lined the edges of the building, watching the crowd. But the students weren't backing down. The sit-in began with a small group of students sitting on the steps, blocking the entrance to the building. Darius and Zoe arrived a little later, walking into the chaotic scene with a mixture of nervous energy and resolve. The air was thick with the tension of what was about to unfold. They were about to take this movement into uncharted waters. Darius climbed the steps to join Zoe, who was already in the center of the group. The scene was electric with determination. Students sat shoulder to shoulder, blocking the entrance to the administration building, chanting in unison, "No justice, no peace." Their voices rang out in perfect harmony, a collective demand for change. There was no turning back now. At 1:30 p.m., the first of the university's administrators emerged from the building, walking briskly toward the protesters. It was Dean Thompson, accompanied by 2 members of the Board of Trustees. He didn't stop to speak but shot a cold glance at the student sitting in front of him. He was trying to appear unbothered, but Darius could sense the unease in the air. The students parted to allow Thompson to approach, but they remained seated, silent for a moment. It was an intentional pause, a signal that they weren't afraid to face the administration head-on. Then Zoe stood up, stepping forward to address the group. "We're here to demand action, Dean Thompson," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "We are not going to let this issue of racial injustice go unaddressed any longer. We are asking for immediate accountability, for both the university and the faculty. If you truly believe in fairness and equality, you will meet with us now. No more waiting, no more empty promises." The dean's face tightened, but he didn't speak. He seemed caught off guard, unsure of how to respond. Darius could see the wheels turning in his head, how to defuse the situation, how to maintain control. "We're not leaving," Zoe continued, her voice growing louder. "We're not backing down. You will meet with us. You will listen to us. And you will make a plan to change. We are not going to be your token students. We're not here to be dismissed anymore." Dean Thompson remained silent for a moment, visibly fuming. Then he spoke, his voice sharp. "This behavior is disruptive. You are affecting the work of this university, and you are forcing us into a corner. We cannot, and will not, negotiate under these conditions." Zoe's eyes never left his. "You don't get to dictate the terms anymore. The time for your negotiations is over. We have been ignored for far too long. And we are done waiting." The standoff between them continued for several minutes, the tension in the air growing thicker with each passing second. But then something unexpected happened. A professor, one Darius recognized from his American history class, stepped forward. It was Professor Montgomery. "I've been hearing the students," Montgomery said, addressing the dean with a tone that held authority. "And I stand with them. If this university is truly committed to learning, it must also be committed to listening. I am here to ensure that our voices are heard." The room fell into a stunned silence. Darius felt a surge of gratitude toward Montgomery. It was a turning point. A key faculty member had just publicly backed the students, and that made all the difference. For a moment, it seemed like the administration might concede. But Dean Thompson's jaw clenched, and he turned on his heel, walking back into the building without another word. The students were left standing in the hot afternoon sun, still on the steps, but their resolve had only grown stronger. The protest had taken on a life of its own. What began as a small act of defiance had become a full-fledged movement, and now it was attracting attention beyond the university campus. The media was starting to take notice. The first few local news outlets had picked up the story, broadcasting images of the sit-in and the crowd of students blocking the entrance to the administration building. Darius couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and anxiety every time he saw the footage. He had never imagined his name would be associated with something this large. He had never wanted to be a symbol, he had only wanted to stand up for what was right. But now, as news outlets all over the region aired coverage of the protest, he was becoming the face of it. Zoe, ever the strategist, saw the potential but also understood the dangers of being thrust into the media spotlight. "Look at this," Zoe said, pointing to her phone as they sat in the student union. "We're trending on social media. This is exactly what we needed. People are starting to talk about this on a larger scale." Darius glanced at the phone screen, where a live feed from one of the local news stations was playing. A reporter stood in front of the administration building, summarizing the growing protests and the demands of the students. A small portion of the segment was dedicated to interviews with students who had participated in the sit-in, including Zoe and Darius. "Yeah, but this is what we have to be careful about," Darius said, his voice heavy with concern. "We're on the radar now. The administration isn't going to let this slide. They're going to retaliate." Zoe's expression turned serious. "I know. They've been quiet so far, but they're not going to sit by and watch us change the narrative. We're hitting them where it hurts, public perception. That's why we need to stay organized and keep pushing." Darius leaned back in his chair, his thoughts swirling. The stakes had escalated so much in just a few days. What started as a protest about a professor's insult was now about challenging the entire system, about dismantling a culture of silence that had allowed discriminatory behaviors to thrive. But now, as the media spotlight grew brighter, the pressure was mounting on both sides. The administration was likely scrambling to figure out how to spin the story, while Darius and his peers were trying to ensure that their message remained clear and focused. That evening, Darius found himself in a meeting with Zoe and several other key student leaders in the movement. They had gathered in a study room in the library to strategize their next steps. "We need to keep this momentum going, but we also need to prepare for what's coming," Zoe said, as she pulled up a series of news articles and social media threads on the screen. "The administration is already working on their response. They're spinning it as if the students are causing unnecessary disruption, and they've even started calling for disciplinary action against the organizers." Darius felt his stomach churn. The fear of retaliation was something he'd expected, but hearing it confirmed in front of him felt real in a way it hadn't before. They were officially on the administration's radar, and that meant the stakes were even higher. "We can't back down," Darius said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "We've already made our point. The media's attention is on us, and we can't let them flip the narrative. We need to keep the conversation focused on the issues of systemic racism and discrimination here at the university." One of the student leaders, Marcus, nodded in agreement. "We need to keep pushing on the admin to meet with us, but we also need to keep talking to the media. If they can't shut us down through fear, they'll try to discredit us. We need to make sure the media knows we're not a bunch of angry students just causing trouble, we're here for change." Zoe stood up and paced the room, her mind clearly racing. "We'll also need to involve alumni. We've got connections with people who've been through this university, and if we can get some influential alumni speaking out, it'll add even more pressure. We can't let the administration treat us like we're a passing inconvenience." Darius nodded, appreciating the careful planning. "What about the sit-in? Should we keep doing that every day?" "Absolutely," Zoe said, her eyes sharp. "We need to make it clear that we're not just going to disappear. We'll rotate shifts, keep the sit-in going at all hours. But we need to be strategic about when we hit them the hardest, when they're most vulnerable." The group agreed, making plans for the next phase of their campaign. It was clear that things were about to get even more intense. The following morning, Darius and Zoe sat in a small cafe off campus, watching the next round of media coverage unfold. The local news had continued to cover the protests, but now it was beginning to attract attention from national outlets. A journalist from the New York Times reached out for an interview with Darius, and although he was hesitant at first, he knew it was the right move. If the movement was going to have real staying power, they needed to bring the issue into the broader conversation. The interview took place over Zoom, with the reporter asking Darius about his experience in the classroom and how it had led to the protests. Darius spoke candidly about the moment in Professor Harrison's class, detailing the insult and the way it had chipped away at his sense of belonging. But he also expanded his message, emphasizing that the protest wasn't just about one individual's actions. It was about a system that allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked. "We are demanding accountability," Darius said in the interview. "This isn't about one professor or one classroom. It's about a culture of silence that's been allowed to exist here for far too long. It's about every student who's felt unsafe, unseen, or unheard." The reporter nodded, scribbling notes. "Do you think the administration will listen?" Darius hesitated. "They're listening now, but whether they act or not remains to be seen. Our message is clear: we're not going anywhere until something changes." The interview aired the following day, and within hours, it went viral. Clips from the interview were shared across social media platforms, gaining traction far beyond the university's campus. Darius could feel the growing weight of his words, but he also felt a sense of responsibility. This was no longer just his fight, it was the fight of all the students who had been silenced before him. Later that evening, the administration released another statement. This time, it was a direct attack on the protest. They condemned the disruptions and claimed that they had already initiated a process to address the concerns of the students. But the wording was carefully crafted, clearly aimed at minimizing the gravity of the situation. It was a calculated attempt to shift the narrative and paint the protest as a minor inconvenience rather than a necessary catalyst for change. Darius knew the administration was trying to regain control of the situation, but the students weren't backing down. The response from the university felt hollow, and the media had already exposed their reluctance to address the real issue at hand. Zoe was quick to rally the group. "We've got them cornered now. They're panicking. They don't know what to do. We've got to keep the pressure up and push for real change." Darius, as nervous as he felt, could only agree. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The morning after the media storm, Darius woke up to a series of text messages from Zoe. She'd been up all night, monitoring the growing media frenzy, and it was clear things were escalating. The administration's latest move had set a new tone. "You need to see this," Zoe's text said. "They've gone too far this time." Darius opened the message, his eyes scanning the link to an article that had just gone live on the university's website. The headline read, "University takes action on student protests, disciplinary measures underway." His heart sank. He had expected retaliation, but reading it in black and white made it all too real. The article stated that the university had initiated disciplinary proceedings against several students involved in the protest, including Darius and Zoe. They claimed the sit-in had disrupted academic schedules, endangered student safety, and violated university policies. The language was sharp, positioning the students as troublemakers who were harming the institution's reputation. Darius could feel the weight of the article pressing down on him. He had known this was coming, but he hadn't prepared himself for it to feel this personal. The message was clear: they were being silenced, targeted not just for their actions, but for challenging the status quo. Zoe immediately called him. "Darius, have you seen this?" "Yeah," Darius replied, his voice tight with frustration. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore. They're coming for us." "We knew it would happen," Zoe said, her tone fierce. "But we can't let them get away with it. This is our moment. We can't back down now." As Darius hung up, he sat still for a moment, processing the new reality. His mind raced through the possibilities. The university had the power to suspend or expel students. The threat felt immediate and tangible. But he couldn't afford to show fear. He had started this movement because he believed in something, and now more than ever, he had to fight for it. That afternoon, Zoe gathered the student leaders in a small meeting room, the walls covered with posters of past protests, movements, and historical figures who had fought for justice. The irony wasn't lost on them. They were now part of a tradition that spanned generations, fighting not just for themselves, but for future generations of students who would walk these same halls. "We need a response," Zoe said as soon as everyone was seated. "We can't let them take us down without a fight. We need to show them we're united. We need to push back harder." One of the student leaders, Marcus, spoke up. "What exactly are we pushing for, Zoe? The administration's already made it clear they're not going to meet our demands unless we play by their rules." Zoe nodded. "I get that, Marcus. But that's the problem. We're not going to play by their rules. We never have been." Darius looked around the room at the faces of his peers. Some were anxious, some resolute. But they were all in this together. He felt a surge of solidarity and strength. "We can't let them turn this into just a few disgruntled students," Darius said, standing up. "We need to make sure this isn't just about us. It's about everyone who has ever been silenced or dismissed. It's about changing the culture here." Zoe's eyes locked with his. "Exactly. We've got the media, we've got the momentum. Now we need to get the alumni involved. We need support from every corner of the university, not just students. Faculty, staff, even parents." Darius nodded. "Let's make sure our message stays clear. We're not going to let them punish us for standing up. We're going to make them listen." Over the next few days, the university attempted to impose sanctions. A few students were called in for disciplinary hearings, and rumors began circulating that the administration was considering suspensions for those who had been the most outspoken. But Darius and Zoe were undeterred. If anything, the retaliation only fueled their resolve. It felt like a line had been drawn in the sand. The next phase of their strategy was to escalate. Zoe worked tirelessly to organize meetings with influential alumni who had the resources and platforms to help amplify their message. She knew that the university could dismiss the voices of students, but they couldn't ignore the weight of its most successful graduates. And it wasn't just the alumni who were stepping up. The students, too, were beginning to organize on an even larger scale. The sit-in at the administration building grew in size, with more and more students joining the protest each day. They were no longer just a small group of activists, they were a movement. And they were unwilling to back down. One morning, as Darius walked into the campus quad, he was greeted by a scene he hadn't anticipated. A flash mob of students had gathered, holding signs and chanting slogans that echoed the demands of the protest. The energy was electric, a mixture of defiance and hope. Darius felt his chest swell with pride. This was no longer just a protest, it was a movement that had taken on a life of its own. Zoe appeared beside him, a grin on her face. "This is what we've been waiting for," she said. "The tide is turning." The flash mob drew the attention of everyone around, and soon, campus security arrived to try and break up the gathering. But the students stood firm, their voices growing louder, their unity unshakable. The administration was losing control of the narrative, and they knew it. But even as the students celebrated their victories, they understood the risks. The administration would not back down without a fight. They had already shown that they were willing to use the full weight of their power to suppress the protests. Yet, every moment that passed only strengthened the resolve of the students. Darius and Zoe knew that the retaliation from the administration was just the beginning of a much bigger battle. Later that day, Darius and Zoe sat together in their usual spot, overlooking the quad. The protests were still ongoing, but they knew the university was ready to take more drastic actions. The pressure on both sides was mounting, but they were more determined than ever. "You know this isn't going to be easy, right?" Zoe said, breaking the silence. "We're going to face a lot more pushback. A lot of people are going to try to tear us down." Darius smiled, the weight of everything they had been through settling on him. "I know. But we've come this far. We can't stop now. We're not just fighting for us, we're fighting for everyone who's been silenced, everyone who's been told to sit down and shut up." Zoe looked out at the crowd of students, who were chanting and raising their fists in solidarity. "We're in this together. And we're going to keep pushing until we see change." The tension had reached its breaking point. It had been weeks since the initial sit-in, and what started as a handful of determined students had now grown into a full-fledged protest that had captured the attention of the entire nation. Media coverage had escalated, and the university's administration was facing relentless public pressure. Still, they had refused to engage meaningfully with the students' demands. Instead, they tried to undermine the protest, using threats of disciplinary action and attempting to discredit the movement. But now, it was clear that they could no longer ignore the growing unrest. Darius stood in front of the administration building, his heart pounding as he looked out over the sea of students gathered before him. It was the largest gathering yet, a crowd of hundreds, their voices unified in a chorus of chants that echoed across the campus. He could feel the heat of their collective energy, the tension in the air as the moment they had all been waiting for finally arrived. Today was the day they would make their final stand. Zoe approached him, her face determined but calm. "Darius, we need to be ready for what comes next. The administration's been quiet for the past few days, but I have a feeling they're preparing for something big. We can't afford to let up now." "I know," Darius said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "This isn't just about us anymore. It's about every student who has ever been silenced or ignored. We have to make them listen." They had prepared for this moment for days. The plan was simple: they would stage one final demonstration, an action that would be impossible for the administration to ignore. A last-ditch effort to force the university to take accountability for the systemic issues that had been festering for years. Darius knew that today's protest had to be bold. It had to be impossible for the administration to pretend it wasn't happening. As the crowd gathered, Zoe moved through the students, offering words of encouragement and reminding them of the importance of staying focused. The energy was palpable, and Darius could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. He had never felt this kind of pressure before. This was it, the climax of everything they had fought for. At the front of the crowd, a massive banner was unfurled, its bold letters reading, "Enough is enough, demand accountability." The students cheered as the banner caught the wind, symbolizing their unified stand. For Darius, seeing that banner felt like the culmination of everything, their resistance, their struggle, their voices rising up against the very institution that had tried to silence them. Zoe stood beside him, her eyes scanning the crowd. "We're ready," she said quietly. "Let's make this count." As they prepared to march toward the administration building, Darius felt a moment of quiet reflection. The fight had been long, and the road ahead remained uncertain, but today was different. Today, they had reached the precipice of real change. He had seen the power of collective action, how even the smallest of voices could echo through the halls of power. But now, he realized, they were no longer just fighting for justice, they were demanding it. And the only way forward was together. The march began, a slow but steady procession of students, chanting in unison. They moved through the campus like a wave, their feet pounding the pavement with the rhythm of purpose. Darius led the front, his posture proud but resolute. As they neared the steps of the administration building, the weight of the moment hit him full force. This was the heart of the university, the very symbol of power and control. But today, it would be their voices that rang out, not the administration's silence. Once the students reached the steps, they formed a circle, surrounding the entrance to the building. Darius and Zoe stood at the center, facing the large glass doors. The air was thick with anticipation, the sound of the students chanting reverberating off the walls. It was a symbolic act, standing there, at the gates of power, refusing to move until they were heard. Until they were acknowledged. The media had already arrived in full force, cameras set up to capture every moment. Darius could feel the pressure of the eyes on him, the weight of their expectations. But he wasn't afraid anymore. He had come this far. There was no turning back. Minutes passed, then hours. The tension grew. The university's security team had arrived, but they were hesitant. No one knew how the administration would respond, and that uncertainty hung in the air. Darius knew the stakes were high. If the protest escalated further, it could spiral out of control. But they had no other choice. This was the only way to make them listen. At long last, a group of university officials emerged from the building. The dean of students, along with several senior administrators, stepped forward, flanked by security. They were met with a chorus of chants and the defiant stares of the students. "Students," the dean began, his voice cutting through the noise. "We understand your concerns, but this disruption is unacceptable. We cannot allow this protest to continue. You are violating university policies, and disciplinary action will be taken against those involved." The words felt hollow, and Darius could see the smugness in the dean's posture. It was clear the administration thought they had the upper hand. But Darius wasn't about to back down. "We're not here for your empty apologies," Darius said, his voice loud and clear, cutting through the crowd. "We're here for accountability. We're here because we've been ignored for too long. We're not leaving until you commit to change." The crowd erupted into cheers, the sound deafening. Zoe stepped forward, standing beside Darius. "We've been patient. We've been peaceful. We've tried every other avenue. But now, it's time for you to answer our demands. We will not be silenced." The dean looked taken aback, but he recovered quickly. "You leave us no choice. We will take action against the students who are leading this disruption." Darius held his ground. "You can suspend us. You can expel us. But you cannot silence the truth. The people have spoken." For a moment, there was a stunned silence, and then, the chants began again. "Accountability now. Accountability now." The dean turned on his heel, signaling for the officials to return inside. But as they retreated, the media cameras continued to roll, capturing every second of the confrontation. Darius could sense that the tide was turning. The administration had been forced to show its hand, and the students had emerged victorious in this battle of wills. The next move was theirs. Later that night, Darius and Zoe sat in the student union, reflecting on what had just transpired. The administration had threatened retaliation, but the media coverage had been overwhelming. They were winning the public battle, but the true test was still to come. Would the university follow through on its threats, or would they finally recognize the power of the students' voices? "We did it," Zoe said, her eyes tired but filled with satisfaction. "This is the moment we've been working for." Darius nodded, but his mind was already focused on the next step. "We can't stop now. The fight's not over. It's just beginning." The week following the showdown at the administration building felt like an eternity. The world outside had not stopped spinning, but for Darius and Zoe, time moved slowly, each passing moment pregnant with uncertainty. The administration had retreated behind closed doors, silent but certainly not idle. The university's reputation hung in the balance, and with every new headline, every new protest, the pressure on the powers that be grew. The campus was a different place now. The once bustling walkways that had always felt like neutral ground were now transformed into symbols of resistance. Every corner, every bench, was now filled with students discussing their rights, their dignity, and their future. The protest had brought them together in ways Darius never imagined. Students who had never spoken to each other now stood side by side, unified in a common cause. Zoe had spent the last few days tirelessly organizing, ensuring that the media would continue to cover their movement and keeping the momentum alive. Meanwhile, Darius focused on preparing for the ultimate confrontation with the administration. He knew that this could either be their victory or the beginning of a long fight. He had made peace with the fact that no matter the outcome, they had already won in ways that were far more important than simply forcing the university to change. The day of the university's response arrived. Darius could feel the energy in the air as he walked toward the quad, where students had gathered in anticipation of what was to come. The crowd had grown even larger, and there was an unspoken understanding among them: today was the final moment, the tipping point. Zoe met Darius near the steps of the main administration building. Her eyes were tired, but they were filled with a fierce determination. "It's now or never," she said. "We've done everything we can. The rest is up to them." Darius nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. He had thought about this moment for days, even weeks, but now that it was here, he couldn't shake the sense of urgency in the pit of his stomach. If they were going to win, it would take more than passion, it would take strategy, unity, and the courage to stand tall in the face of the unknown. A buzz spread through the crowd as university officials emerged from the building. At the forefront, the same dean who had confronted them days earlier walked slowly toward the steps, flanked by several other senior officials. This time, the air was heavy with the weight of their responsibility. The students stood silent, waiting for the official response. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The dean cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. He was visibly uncomfortable, caught between the pressure of the administration and the overwhelming force of the students' demand. Darius stepped forward, the crowd parting to allow him space. "We've heard your voices," the dean said, his tone neutral, but strained. "We acknowledge the concerns raised by these protests. And after considerable review, the university administration has come to a decision." Darius held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. This would determine everything. The dean continued. "The university will implement new measures to address diversity and inclusion, beginning immediately. We will be creating a task force to review the hiring and promotion practices of faculty, ensuring that professors reflect the diverse body of students we serve. We will also increase resources for Black student organizations and provide mentorship programs designed to ensure that underrepresented students have equal access to opportunities for academic success." The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the full weight of the dean's statement. Would this be enough? Would this change the system that had been so resistant to change for so long? But, the dean added, his voice taking on a more somber tone, "Professor Matthews will not be removed from his position, as we believe in the principles of academic freedom. While his comments were hurtful, we feel that the matter should be handled through internal channels." A murmur of disappointment rippled through the crowd. It wasn't the sweeping victory they had hoped for. But the fact that the university was finally acknowledging the problem was, in itself, a significant shift. Darius stepped forward once again, his voice firm. "This is a start," he said, his words cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "But this isn't enough. We need accountability. We need to know that the university is committed to real change, not just cosmetic gestures. You can't just slap a few policies together and call it progress. You need to take responsibility for the harm that's been done." Zoe joined him, standing beside him on the steps, her presence steady. "We're not here just to be appeased. We're here to ensure that this university stops tolerating discrimination and starts taking real action. We want to see change, and we'll keep fighting until we see it." The crowd erupted into cheers. It was clear that the administration's response, while significant, was only the beginning of a much larger conversation. The students had won a battle, but the war for justice was far from over. Later that evening, after the rally had dispersed, Darius and Zoe sat in their usual spot by the student union, watching the sunset together. The weight of everything that had happened settled around them like a blanket, but there was a sense of peace that came with knowing they had given everything they had to this cause. "We did it," Zoe said quietly, her voice filled with relief and exhaustion. We actually did it. Darius smiled, but his eyes were reflective. Yeah, we did. But it's not over. Not by a long shot. Zoe nodded, her gaze shifting to the horizon. I know. But we've shown them that they can't keep ignoring us. We've made our voices heard. And that's the first step in changing everything. Darius looked at her, his expression softening. This was never just about us. It was about every student who's been ignored, every student who's been told their voice doesn't matter. We've changed the conversation here. We've made them see that they can't get away with treating people like this. Zoe smiled. And that's only the beginning. We've started something bigger than ourselves. The university had responded. The protest had shaken the institution to its core, forcing it to confront the inequalities that had been allowed to fester for far too long. While the resolution wasn't perfect, Professor Matthews still remained in his position. The change was undeniable. The students had pushed for accountability, and they had gotten results. Darius knew that their work wasn't finished, but for the first time in weeks, he felt hopeful. The fight had been long, and the road ahead would still be difficult. But the students had proven something crucial: their voices mattered. And as long as they were willing to fight for what was right, change was possible. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?